December 29, 2006. The British Treasury made a final payment to the United States government, $83 million. It was not a ceremonial gesture. It was not symbolic. It was the last installment on a debt signed more than 60 years earlier. A debt that began in the middle of World War II. Britain had just finished paying for the war, 61 years after victory. 3 generations of British taxpayers paid the United States for surviving the most destructive conflict in human history. This isn't what they taught you. You were taught that America saved Britain. You were taught that Lend-Lease was generosity. You were taught that allies stood shoulder to shoulder against tyranny. That story is incomplete, because that debt was not the cost of winning the war. It was the price America charged Britain for the right to stay in the war, and the interest payments were only the visible layer. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States executed the largest nonviolent transfer of wealth ever recorded. No invasion, no conquest, no occupation, just contracts, clauses, deadlines. Britain entered World War II as the world's largest creditor nation. It controlled a quarter of the planet. Its currency anchored global trade, its capital financed continents. Britain exited the war bankrupt, its gold gone, its overseas investments liquidated, its global markets surrendered. Its military bases leased away for 99 years, and its empire dismantled. This wasn't charity, this wasn't partnership, this was extraction. And it happened while Britain was fighting for survival. The popular version of history says Lend-Lease was aid, that America loaned weapons and supplies so democracy could survive. That the arrangement was temporary, fair, necessary, but read the documents, follow the payments, track the assets. Lend-Lease was not designed to save the British Empire. It was designed to replace it. The United States did not inherit global power after the war by accident. It acquired it through a calculated financial strategy executed during Britain's moment of maximum vulnerability. And the most important part is this: Britain did not lose its empire on the battlefield. It lost it in conference rooms, in treasury offices, in legal clauses buried inside aid agreements. While bombs fell on London, British negotiators were being asked to open their balance sheets to a foreign power. While merchant ships were being sunk in the Atlantic, British assets were being priced, evaluated, and sold. While soldiers fought Hitler, the future of the British economy was being quietly dismantled. This story is not taught because it reframes everything. It reframes World War II, it reframes the special relationship. And it reframes how modern empires are built, because the United States did not rise by conquering Britain, it rose by financing Britain's desperation. And Britain agreed. Because there was no alternative. When people talk about American power, they point to aircraft carriers and military bases. But those came later. The foundation was debt, the weapon was liquidity, and the battlefield was a collapsing ally. The mechanisms used against Britain during World War II did not disappear in 1945. They were refined, standardized, exported. The same logic appears again and again in the post-war world. Crisis creates dependence. Dependence demands concessions. Concessions transfer wealth and control. Germany, Japan, South Korea. And dozens of others followed variations of the same path. Britain was simply the first. The most powerful empire on earth did not fall to an enemy. It was dismantled by its closest ally through debt, forced liquidation, and contractual obligation. The mythology says Britain won the war and America paid the bill. The reality is that America paid the bill by taking Britain's future, and it all began not with a treaty or a battle or a declaration of war. It began with a letter. A letter written by a desperate prime minister to a rising superpower, a letter that historians describe as a plea for help. In reality, it was something else entirely. It was the opening bid in the liquidation of the British Empire. In the next part, you'll see what Britain looked like before that letter was written, how strong it was, how dominant, and why the collapse that followed was not inevitable, it was engineered. Power before the crisis. To understand what was taken from Britain, you first have to understand what Britain was. Before September 1939, Britain was not a declining power. It was the center of the global system. The British Empire controlled approximately 5 million square kilometers of territory. Nearly 1/4 of the Earth's land surface. More than 450 million people lived under British rule. No empire in history had ever managed power on that scale without collapsing under its own weight. Britain had found a way. The engine of that system was finance. London was the financial capital of the world. Not New York, not Paris, London. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. International trade was priced in pounds. Central banks held sterling as their primary reserve. Shipping contracts, insurance, commodity pricing all flowed through London. British citizens and institutions owned vast overseas investments. By 1939, Britain held roughly $22 billion in foreign assets, equivalent to more than $450 billion today. These were not abstract holdings, they were physical control. Railways in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, oil concessions in Persia, rubber plantations in Malaya. Banks across Africa and Asia. These assets generated continuous income streams that flowed back to Britain. The empire paid for itself. Britain was not rich because it extracted taxes from colonies. It was rich because it owned the infrastructure of global trade. And at the core of this system was gold. Britain entered World War II holding approximately $6 billion in gold reserves, second only to the United States. Gold backed the pound, gold guaranteed trust, gold made Britain solvent in any crisis, or so it appeared. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain declared war. But Britain did not enter that war prepared for a prolonged industrial conflict. The First World War had drained Britain deeply. The interwar years were marked by debt repayment, economic stagnation, and fragile recovery. Britain still looked dominant, but its margin for error was thin. The moment war began, that margin disappeared. Britain was an island nation dependent on imports. It imported over 50% of its food. It imported oil, metals, machinery, raw materials. War disrupted everything. German U-boats targeted merchant shipping relentlessly. Every ship sunk was not just a military loss, it was an economic one. Imports became more expensive. Insurance costs soared, supply chains fractured. At the same time, Britain had to rearm at unprecedented speed. Aircraft, tanks, ammunition, ships. British industry could not produce enough fast enough. The only country with the industrial capacity to fill the gap was the United States. But the United States was officially neutral, and neutrality had rules. Under American law, belligerent nations could purchase weapons only under cash and carry. Pay in full, no credit, no loans. And transport the goods yourself. It was a legal framework that favored one side of the Atlantic. The United States had factories. Britain had gold, so Britain paid. In the first months of the war, Britain burned through reserves at a staggering rate. Gold was shipped across the Atlantic to pay American manufacturers. Foreign investments were liquidated to raise dollars. Assets that had taken generations to build were sold in weeks. This was not mismanagement, it was necessity. By mid-1940, France had fallen. Britain stood alone. The Luftwaffe bombed British cities nightly. The Royal Navy fought for control of the Atlantic. The British Army was rebuilding after the evacuation at Dunkirk, and the bills kept coming. In June 1940, Britain launched Operation Fish. Its entire gold reserve and negotiable securities were loaded onto warships and civilian liners. They were sent across the Atlantic to Canada and the United States for safekeeping and payment. It was the largest physical transfer of national wealth in history. Gold bars, bonds, securities. The financial core of an empire placed on ships and sent into exile. By November 1940, the gold was gone. Britain was still ordering weapons, still fighting, still losing ships faster than they could be replaced. But the Treasury in London faced a hard truth. There were no dollars left. Britain was not short on funds. It was bankrupt. 7 months into a war that would last 6 years, the world's largest empire had exhausted its liquid resources. This is the moment most histories gloss over, because it is uncomfortable. Britain was not defeated on the battlefield. It was defeated on the balance sheet. And the United States knew it. American officials were not guessing. They had the numbers. They tracked Britain's reserves week by week. They knew exactly how long Britain could survive without assistance, which meant they also knew something else. Britain had no leverage. By late 1940, Britain's power was still visible, but hollow. The empire existed on maps, not in cash. The navy sailed, but the fuel came from abroad. The factories worked, but the inputs were imported. Britain needed American supplies to survive, not to win, to survive. And survival is the most expensive commodity of all. When Winston Churchill sat down to write to Franklin Roosevelt in December 1940, he was not negotiating as an equal. He was negotiating from a position of exhaustion. The empire still stood, but the foundation had cracked. What followed was not a rescue, it was a transaction. And once the crisis exposed Britain's vulnerability, the rules of the relationship changed permanently. In the next part, you'll see exactly how that vulnerability was exploited. Clause by clause, asset by asset, agreement by agreement, not with tanks, with paperwork. How wealth was transferred while Britain had no choice. The mythology of Lend-Lease begins with generosity. The reality begins with accounting. When Winston Churchill wrote to Franklin Roosevelt in December 1940, the letter is remembered as a plea for help between allies. Read closely, it was something else. Churchill was not asking for aid, he was informing the United States that Britain could no longer pay. That distinction mattered, because from the perspective of the U.S. Treasury, this was not a moral crisis. It was a financial one. The man who controlled the response was Henry Morgenthau, Jr., Secretary of the Treasury. Morgenthau was Roosevelt's closest economic advisor, and he approached Britain's desperation with a simple principle. If Britain still had assets, Britain could still pay. Before a single dollar of Lend-Lease assistance would be approved, Morgenthau demanded proof that Britain was completely exhausted, not politically, financially. In December 1940, British officials were ordered to provide a comprehensive inventory of assets across the entire empire. Government holdings, private investments, corporate ownership, foreign securities, this was unprecedented. Britain was fighting for its existence. London was under nightly bombardment, and America's condition for support was full financial disclosure. The British delegation, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, objected. They warned that forced liquidation during wartime would result in fire sale prices. They argued that selling long-term overseas investments would cripple Britain's post-war recovery. Morgenthau was unmoved. His position was clear. American taxpayers would not subsidize Britain while British wealth still existed anywhere in the world. Liquidate first, then talk. To convince Congress, Morgenthau needed evidence. He needed Britain to make a visible sacrifice. He found it in American Viscose Corporation. American Viscose was the largest rayon and artificial silk manufacturer in the United States. It was owned by Courtaulds, a British firm. The company was profitable, strategically important, and worth over $100 million. More importantly, it generated steady dollar income that flowed back to Britain. Morgenthau demanded its sale. The British government resisted. Selling a major industrial asset under duress would destroy value, but Morgenthau issued an ultimatum. Sell American Viscose or Lend-Lease would fail in Congress. In March 1941, under emergency war powers, the British government seized American Viscose from its owners. It was a compulsory acquisition. The sale was handled by American investment banks. They knew Britain had no alternatives. The result was predictable. American Viscose sold for $54, $4 million, roughly half its true value. The proceeds went directly to the U.S. Treasury. The British government compensated Courtaulds in pounds, increasing domestic debt. This was not commerce, it was foreclosure, and it set the pattern. Over the next months, Britain was forced to liquidate $650 million in American securities and corporate holdings. Stocks, bonds, equity positions accumulated over decades. By mid-1941, Britain had sold more than $1 billion in U.S. assets, over $22 billion today. Every transaction was monitored, verified, approved. Only after the liquidation was complete did Lend-Lease supplies begin to flow, but asset sales were only one layer. The second was territory. In September 1940, before Lend-Lease was even approved, Britain agreed to the Destroyers for Bases deal. Britain needed ships to fight German submarines. The United States offered 50 World War I-era destroyers. They were obsolete, poorly maintained, barely seaworthy. In exchange, Britain granted the United States 99-year leases on military bases across the Atlantic world. Newfoundland, Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, Antigua, British Guiana. These bases gave the United States strategic control of the North Atlantic and Caribbean. They formed the backbone of America's post-war military reach. Britain traded permanent geopolitical leverage for temporary survival. The imbalance was stark, but the most consequential extraction was buried inside the Lend-Lease agreement itself. Article VII. On its surface, Article VII required the elimination of discriminatory trade practices after the war, free trade, open markets. In reality, it targeted imperial preference. Imperial preference was the economic glue of the British Empire, a tariff system that favored British goods within imperial markets. Canada, Australia, India, South Africa, they bought British products not because they were superior but because tariffs made them cheaper. Article VII required Britain to dismantle this system. That meant opening empire markets to American competition. The British negotiators understood the implications immediately. American industry was larger, more efficient, more productive. Without tariff protection, British manufacturers would be overwhelmed. But Britain signed because German bombers were overhead. Because the Atlantic supply line was collapsing, because survival came first. Lend-Lease passed Congress in March 1941. Britain received approximately $31 billion in aid over 4 years. The propaganda called it the arsenal of democracy. The documents called it a lease, and leases have end dates. As the war continued, the asymmetry widened. Britain converted nearly all industry to war production. Exports collapsed. Overseas markets were abandoned. American industry expanded. Factories produced weapons for war and consumer goods for global markets simultaneously. U.S. GDP grew by 75% during the war. Britain's economy stagnated. By 1944, the transfer was complete. Gold flowed to the United States. Markets shifted to American firms. Financial gravity moved from London to New York. Britain was still fighting, but economically the outcome was already decided. In the next part, you'll see what happened when the war ended and why Britain's collapse accelerated the moment peace arrived. Victory without sovereignty. When the war ended, Britain expected relief. What it received was exposure. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The Second World War was over. In London, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Church bells rang. The empire had survived. 7 days later, on August 21, 1945, the lifeline was cut. President Harry Truman signed an executive order terminating Lend-Lease immediately. No transition, no grace period, no warning. American supply ships already at sea were ordered to turn around. Britain's government was stunned. Its economy had been fully reorganized for war. Factories produced tanks, not consumer goods. Exports had vanished. Food, fuel, and raw materials were still being imported, paid for with Lend-Lease dollars. When those dollars stopped, Britain faced a new crisis. Not invasion, not bombing, starvation. The man tasked with confronting this reality was John Maynard Keynes, the most influential economist of the century. By 1945, Keynes was gravely ill. Heart disease had weakened him, but he traveled to Washington anyway. Britain needed a loan. Keynes believed Britain had a moral claim. Britain had fought alone for 2 years. It had exhausted itself defending Europe. The empire had been liquidated in the process. He argued for a grant, not a loan, $6 billion, a recognition of sacrifice. The American response was procedural. Congress was tired of Europe. The American public wanted demobilization, not generosity. And Britain's new Labour government, with its plans for nationalization, made Washington uneasy. The offer was not aid, it was debt. In July 1946, the Anglo-American loan agreement was signed, $3.75 billion at 2% interest, and it came with conditions. The most destructive was sterling convertibility. Britain was required to make the pound fully convertible into dollars within 1 year. Anyone holding pounds, governments, corporations, colonies, would be free to exchange them for dollars on demand. Keynes understood immediately. During the war, Britain had forced its colonies to accept payment in pounds. Those pounds could only be spent on British goods. It was a closed system that protected British industry. Convertibility would open the floodgates. Everyone would sell pounds. Everyone would buy dollars. Keynes warned it would be catastrophic. He fought the clause until his health collapsed. In April 1946, Keynes died. The agreement survived him. On July 15, 1947, Britain made the